Good afternoon, everyone, and we're turning today to the question of the issues behind the role of markets in the effort to try to deal with climate change issues. As we've been talking over the last few weeks, the basic problem has always been, once there's a consensus on trying to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases, how best to try to go about doing that. And of course, one answer is to impose some kind of regulatory cap, regulatory ceiling on the amount of greenhouse gases that can be emitted. But there are two problems. One is the argument that economists always make about efficiency. The second is, given the fact that greenhouse gas emissions is a global problem, and given the fact that there is no global governance system of any kind in existence yet, which could impose and then enforce those kinds of strategies, the question is how you'd go about trying to impose those caps anyway. And so there's been a resort to market strategies in an effort to try to deal with the efficiency question and deal with the governance problem. And over the course so far in previous lectures, we've explored some of those issues and some of those strategies. But the issue today that we want to try to deal with is what happens with the issues that lie behind the market strategies, with the puzzles of trying to figure out, first, the fact that global and even local issues of pollution don't affect everyone equally. There really is a problem of trying to think about issues of equity in terms of what the impacts are. The second thing is that in creating these market-based strategies, we're essentially creating not only a market that didn't exist previously, but in some cases, we're creating a marketable item that didn't exist previously, the so-called right to pollute. That's one of the things that Raymond deals with in the book that everyone has read for today. The third issue has to do with the broader puzzles and problems of equity, of how we try to think about, how we try to deal with, how we try to address those problems of equity that more broadly creep into all the nooks and crannies when we start talking about the puzzles and the problems of what to do about market-based strategies for dealing with climate change. To illustrate why this matters, let me put up a map. And this is a map from about a decade ago that looks at a couple of things. It is the estimates the number of premature deaths per 100,000 population in the United States, as well as power plants that burn dirtier versions of coal. And the interesting thing about this is that dirty coal and the emissions from these dirty power plants, in a sense, are matched up pretty well with the pollution that's generated and with the death rates per 100,000 and premature death rates in the adult population. When you start talking about environmental concerns, when you start talking about emissions of greenhouse gases, when you start talking about effects that come from those greenhouse gases, when you start talking, in this case, of premature deaths that seem to be related to the emissions of greenhouse gases of a certain kind, relatively dirtier greenhouse gases that lead to relatively higher levels of premature deaths, there seems to be a connection. There are a lot of other things that could explain what's going on, to be sure. It could be connected with poverty, because some of these areas represent as well some of the poorer parts of the country, and especially some of the problems that some areas of the country have in providing health care. But there are inner cities in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Chicago, and Denver, in New York and Boston and Philadelphia, all of which have problems of poverty and problems of providing good health care, and they don't have the same high concentration. There seems to be a connection here between the emissions of greenhouse gases from old generation power plants that have a tendency to burn relatively dirtier coal on the one side, and the existence of premature deaths per 100,000 in the population. In this case, the darker, the redder the area in the graph, the more likely it is that the people who are living there are going to suffer premature deaths. The implications of this? Well, first, pollution and the effects of pollution, greenhouse gases and the effects of greenhouse gases are not felt by everyone equally. Here's a case where, depending on the nature of the pollution, it seems fairly clear that some of those effects really are felt by some individuals, depending where they live, more intensely, depending on how closely they live to some of the sources of some of these greenhouse gas emitters. That the effects sometimes can be quite serious in terms of premature death in particular. In short, they're questions of equity that hide around the corners of almost all environmental policy issues. In a general sense, we're all interested in trying to reduce the overall level of emissions of greenhouse gases. In terms of the amount of pollution that's being put out, the argument is that we're all better off if we can find a way to address these problems. In terms of the broader puzzles that we have to try to deal with on a global basis, it's one world, one environment, one atmosphere, one collection of gases that tends overall to affect us all. But if you start peeling back the issues, the sources of the problems and the sources of the impacts don't tend to be equal. And they don't tend to be equally felt, and the pain doesn't tend to be equally suffered by everyone involved. As we saw in earlier lectures, one of the other puzzles that we're trying to deal with as well is what happens in relatively poorer countries that may not have contributed significantly at all to greenhouse gas emissions, that may be suffering in terms of how climate change may affect the amount of rainfall and other things that occur in their populations, that may undermine their kind of economy and economic growth that they're capable of being able to create, and in particular how much of a sustainable agriculture that they can maintain as well if the amount of rainfall is diminished as well. Underlying all of this, in short, is an important notion that while on the one hand it's not only real but also in some ways tempting to think about greenhouse gas emissions as solely something that affects everybody relatively equally, the fact is that both the causes and the effects are not equal. The consequences and the costs are not equal. The implications about how to try to deal with all of these things are not equal. In short, everything having to do with climate change has a distributional impact of some kind. And everything that has a distributional impact has a political impact as well. So it's a way of saying that all questions of climate change deal with puzzles of politics, markets, and equity, and trying to figure out how not only to be efficient, but also how best to be fair. One of the things that Raymond argues in the book early on, as an especially powerful phrase, how would we decide who would get what share of the new environmental rights created by these market-based policies? Because not only are the costs and the consequences of climate change being, not only are they affected in differential ways, but in addition to that, the effort to try to deal with this creates new rights, new properties, new kinds of mechanisms that then also tend to have different and differential impacts as well. The central point then is this. The causes of climate change are felt and generated differently and have different impacts on different people. The strategies and efforts to try to deal with climate change create different impacts on different kinds of people. Some people who suffer didn't have anything to do with causing the problem. Some of the people who have to pay the consequences disproportionately are influenced by their contribution to it. Everything has some distributional impact. Some people pay more than others, suffer more than others, benefit more than others, end up having the ability to be able to benefit from markets more than others. Some people benefit more from different kinds of strategies. Some suffer more as a result of other kinds of strategies. The real important questions are who benefits most, who suffers most, where are they, what kind of impacts are they, and how we try to deal with this. It's one thing to talk about markets, but it's very easy and very tempting to start talking about markets as if the only thing that matters is efficiency, and that the implications of the market behaviors tend to affect everybody relatively equally. But in fact, as we all know, the behavior of markets is not nearly quite so antiseptic, and that the costs, the consequences can be very severe on some people and more severe on some people compared to others. So the first point that we want to try to make today is that the allocation of costs and benefits, of winners and losers in anything having to do with climate change or anything having to do with the environment more generally has an unequal distribution. And because the distribution is unequal, it creates all kinds of very interesting political, policy, economic, and governance issues as we try to figure out who wins and loses. And a corollary, any important evidence, any important analysis, any way to try to think carefully about this has got to begin by trying to understand in a relative sense who wins, who loses, who pays, who doesn't. as a result of any of the alternatives that we think about. And so any effort to try to deal with climate change has to begin with an understanding of this differential distribution of benefits and costs, which gets us really then to the second piece. One of the ways that both in the Kyoto Protocol, in the case of the American efforts to try to deal with sulfur dioxide, in some of the strategies in the European Union in which markets have been created, there's been this effort to engage in a variety of cap and trade policies. The idea of imposing an overall level, an overall ceiling on the amount of emissions that are going to be allowed, and then allowing individuals to be able to buy and trade the right to pollute. There are a couple things that are important about this. The first is that when people start talking about the right to pollute, that is the kind of thing that, for many people with environmental concerns, sends shivers up and down their spines. What do you mean, the right to pollute? You're allowed to pollute? But the argument, as you know, that economists have made for a long time is that it's much more efficient to create incentives for the people who can most effectively and most efficiently reduce the amount of pollution to do so. So that's the argument behind the cap and trade markets. But to begin with the idea that there's a right to pollute is something that just sends shivers up and down the spines of many people talking about these issues. Once you get beyond that, there's a second set of questions. What do you mean a right to pollute? Because a right to pollute is not anything that previously existed before governments created it. Doesn't mean that there wasn't pollution and that people who were engaged in manufacturing often didn't create all kinds of pollution that go along with things. People who were engaging in manufacturing processes would often throw things out the back door, down the river, over the mountaintop. At the end of the Bush administration, in fact, there was an effort to try to make it easier for coal operators and other mine operators who operated by working the tops of mountains to make it easier for them to dispose of their debris, which they often did just by throwing it over the sides of the mountain, which in some cases endangered species living underneath. It's easy to try to solve the pollution problems simply by tossing it literally over the landscape to someone else. The argument for a market-based solution, especially one that establishes a cap and which encourages trading underneath it, creates a market that didn't exist before on a good that previously also did not exist before. And as Raymond argues, there's some things that are important here. In the United States, the variability to be able to engage in this operation didn't exist before the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990. And what the Clean Air Act amendments created was this cap and trade market in which the right to pollute was established, where there was the ability to be able to pollute a certain amount of tonnage of pollutants going up in the atmosphere, where the right to pollute was fully transferable, could be bought and sold, so that if you had a right to pollute and somebody else wanted to pay more for you than it cost you to reduce your own pollution, you'd say, this is efficient, let me give that a try. So that the right to pollution was essentially created as a market that, in addition to being fully transferable, you're not allowed to pollute without a license, so you just can't put stuff up in the atmosphere without the license to be able to do it, and that the number of allowances can be reduced. Now, in a sense, this is all sensible in terms of governmental policy because we'll say, well, establish a cap, allow the people who can reduce pollution most efficiently to do so, allow people to buy and sell the right on the inside. But there's also implicit in all of this the ability to be able to reduce the cap over time, to be able to bring the level of pollution down. Because no one really believes that we can continue to pollute at the same level that we are now and effectively deal with greenhouse gas emissions. And so here's where things get, from the point of view of property, really complicated. The complication here is that you're creating and giving somebody a right, somebody a property, that is the right to pollute. But you're also saying at the same time that I, as the government, reserve the right at some point to reduce the amount of property that you have. This is one of the very few areas in which government would even imagine engaging in this kind of activity. Because, for example, if I have land, to make the case easy, I say I own 100 acres of land, The government recognizes my ownership of 100 acres of land. In most countries of the world, the government doesn't have the right to come in and take the land away from me for whatever reason without at least compensating me for it. And the ability of the government to take my land away from me is limited to begin with. Maybe if the government needs to put a new highway through the middle of my property, that there are provisions for allowing the government to take the land, but there's always a sense of compensation. What's important about the right to pollute is that it didn't exist before. Land, of course, did exist before. The right to pollute is something that's a net bad, and on the other hand, owning a piece of property is seen as a good. In both cases, we can buy and sell. But beyond that is the sense that the government can come in and reduce my right to pollute, to take property out of existence, to take the right out of existence without compensation, just in an effort to try to crank down the level of greenhouse gases that exist out there, without having to engage in compensation, where it can't do that otherwise. And so this market that's being created is, as everybody recognizes, artificial. It is subject to different kinds of rules, and it has different kinds of implications. Because not only does the source of pollution affect people differently and have different distributional consequences, the effort to create a market creates different, yet again, distributional consequences. Creating a good where the supply and the value of what's being traded can be reduced can have consequences in a distributional sense, and that the amount where it can be brought down has further distributional consequences. And so what's important here about this argument that Raymond makes, is an understanding in two ways. First, what are we doing here? What's sort of the nature of this market? And it's one thing to argue, as you might, just purely from an economic sense, that what's important here is just simply the matter of efficiency. But what Raymond also argues is that what's also going on here is a question of equity. It's a question of fairness in terms of the rules of the game, and in terms of the fact that some people inevitably will win and others will lose as a result of creating a game that didn't exist before. And that any debate about the Kyoto Protocol, about sulfur dioxide, about anything that creates a market-based mechanism for reducing the overall level of greenhouse gas emissions has distributional consequences that must be considered, but, as she argues, often is not. And so the challenge is trying to figure out how to get at these questions that are essential without finding a way to confuse things further. Let's look at some of the puzzles that get raised by any effort to try to deal with these issues. First has to do with the international arena. What's happened as a result of this market-based set of strategies to deal with greenhouse gas emissions is the creation of markets that didn't exist before, and the markets are trading goods that didn't exist previously. And the Kyoto Protocol was an effort to try to get everybody to reduce the amount of pollution, reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions through this market system, and in doing so to create that market. But the problem with Kyoto is not only the fact that the United States didn't opt in to this market system that was in existence, not in existence previously, was called into existence as a result of Kyoto, but more generally, all systems of property law, all systems of law of any kind, tend to be based on nation states. And while we have systems of international law, they don't extend very deeply into these questions about what to do with properties that didn't exist before, that is, this notion of what to do about the right to pollute. Different countries might deal with and assume and simply think about these questions in different kinds of ways. And so we have the further problem of trying to figure out how to synchronize all the different nation states' approaches to this issue of property. And then we need to try to find ways of making sure that this is enforced. So the great advantage of trying to deal with the issue of greenhouse gas emissions through a market-based strategy is that it creates all kinds of incentives to drive greater efficiency through the process. The great problem with it is that it's all based on the assumption of creating a property that didn't exist before, this right to pollute, rules of the game for how it ought to be traded based on the decisions that were made by individual nation states that somehow have to be synchronized, and the overall effort to try to figure out how to reduce that level over time in ways in which some countries inevitably are going to lose and some countries inevitably are going to win, and how you try to play the game out in a way that you keep the game going to be able to achieve the overall level of reduction that you want without creating international forces that undermine the very process that you're trying to create. That's a pretty big mouthful. What we have here, as Raymond argues, is theory that's in advance of the research. The argument is, let's create a market. Let's create a market by creating a property. We'll create this property and engage in trading across national borders, and we'll gradually reduce the amount of pollution that's possible, and in the end, we'll reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are out there. In a kind of broad sense, it makes perfect sense in terms of understanding about how this works, and in particular about what the equity considerations are. That is, who wins, who loses, what the distributional implications are. The theory is way, 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 way in advance of our understanding about how it's likely to work. And as we all know, and as we can clearly predict, the odds that a system like this is going to work over the long haul will depend on, first, each nation's understanding of whether or not they're being treated fairly, and second, if there are different winners and losers, how the market's going to work its way through so that the people who, relatively speaking, lose have an incentive to stay in the game. In many ways, the next generation of issues that we deal with in trying to deal in a global sense with climate change will demand that we deal in some ways effectively with these puzzles. The second thing is this matter of rights that exist out there. People, quite frankly, are in many cases not comfortable with the idea that pollution is a right or could be construed as a right, that we could somehow even create a market that is established on the assumption that pollution could be created as a right. It's a very complicated notion that with it carries all kinds of normative value-based consequences as well. And so the second major thing that we have to do is just find a way to wrap our heads collectively around the notion of something that we see as bad can be created as a right, and that the right that's created can be bought and sold, and then that the right to buy it and sell it creates distributional implications that we may or may not like. At this point, things get very complicated, and it's another case where the reality is substantially in advance of our ability to be able to think through how to try to make it work well. Another set of puzzles has to do with the basic problems of equity here. The real puzzle here is that we have unequal distribution of rights that are based on existing patterns, as well as changes that we're trying to establish through law. What are the rules of the game by which this is going to happen? What's going to guarantee, as much as we can, that what we do is fair? How are we going to try to make people feel at least confident in the process, even if they lose, relatively speaking, that it's a process that's worthwhile overall? It's conceivable that we could convince the relative losers in the game, whoever they may be, that they need to stay in the game, that they will want to stay in the game because, in a broader sense, that the level of pollution is going to be brought down, and we all are committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, to try to deal overall with climate change. But to be able to do that, there has to be at least some confidence in the way in which the game is being played, such that people don't end up feeling that they're being double-crossed, that people don't feel that there's some quiet side game that is in some way steering the process in an uncomfortable or an unpleasant or an unfair kind of way. The solutions don't necessarily require that everybody win equally and everybody lose equally, but it has to be based at least on a common understanding about what the basic rules of the game are, the sense that everybody understands the game and understands that it's fair. But even that, as Raymond points out in the book, is not quite enough, because it's a matter of a search for balance. Everything having to do with markets, of course, is a matter of finding balance. Markets operate at their core in an effort to try to balance supply and demand. Everything that's interesting about economics is about how that works or sometimes doesn't. But it's not only a matter of balancing supply and demand, about the right to pollute with the cost to do so. It has to do with a couple things. First, how to secure property rights. Does everybody have equal ownership to this thing that's created? Is there a risk that by creating the right to pollute, that you grant more benefit to the people who are already polluting and therefore reward people for bad behavior in the past? So what kind of incentives do you want to create, and how do you want to try to create property in a way that everybody else will perceive as fair? And there really is a problem in this game in some cases where the property that's being created is being seen as rewarding people who in some cases didn't behave well in the past because they polluted to a higher degree than they should have. Then there's the question of the impact. You create this market. Are there some people who are involved in this market likely to suffer more than others? Are they likely to pay a higher cost than others? Are they likely to have to suffer higher levels of pollution than others? As we saw earlier on one of the slides, happening to live near some power plants tends to bring with it a greater chance that you may die prematurely because of the pollution that those power plants emit. And so depending on how you create and where you create and how you draw the cap and engage in the trading underneath, you could have a situation where overall the cap is met, but where some people inside that cap suffer more than others as a result. And you can do that on a small scale, on a scale of a nation state, on the scale of a continent, on the scale of the world, and it's on each of these levels there are differential impacts for who it is who wins and who it is who loses. The last piece has to do with how much individuals have to pay to participate in this game. And one of the consequences here, one of the possible issues could very well be that individuals who had relatively little to contribute to the problem to begin with and may very well have relatively little to lose in the short term, but may suffer in the longer term more catastrophic consequences from climate change, may also be in relatively less developed countries who suffer more in terms of income. If one standard of equity could very well be that people who have equal levels of income, equal levels of wealth, ought to pay roughly equal amounts to try to reduce the overall level of pollution. It would be unfair, people would argue, if people who are relatively poor have to pull more money out of their pocket to be able to make their contribution to an overall level of climate change and greenhouse gas reduction. So the questions of equity have to do with how the ownership of these new rights that are being created are distributed. Is that done in a fair way? It has to do with the impact of the way in which the game is being played, and is it played out in a way that's fair? And then finally, it has to do with how much it affects individuals in terms of their own individual wealth and income, countries' individual wealth and income. And issues of equity could be very serious if it turns out that people who polluted in the past end up with greater supplies of these rights, that the impact is felt disproportionately, so that people who didn't contribute as much to causing the problem end up having a disproportionate pain that they have to bear, and that in the long run, the amount of pain may be borne disproportionately by the amount of income that people have to contribute to the game to begin with. It's not clear how that would work. One of Raymond's arguments, in fact, is that in many ways, our efforts to try to develop and devise the system is well in advance of our understanding of how it's likely to work. But the flip side of that is how it's likely to work will condition how long and how well it can be sustained, which really suggests that not only do we need a market, but we need as well a governance system of some kind to be able to deal with these questions that inevitably will come up. We need to have some way to be able to talk about these things, resolve them, and figure out how it is we're going to address these questions that inevitably are part of things. It's simply creating a market is not enough, because markets, once they're created in these kinds of items, create all kinds of distributional consequences that have to be thought through, and have to be thought through very carefully. So what we have as a result of all this is a series of important questions. It doesn't mean that we need to abandon by any means the effort to try to seek market-based solutions, but on the other hand, it's the argument that we need to wrestle with. Market-based solutions create all kinds of distributional consequences. Distributional consequences have political implications, and political issues require governance solutions. And so in a sense, we circle back around so that efforts to try to deal with the fundamental problem, the problem that we don't have governance systems that are capable of being able to solve global climate change puzzles, get us back the effort to try to work through markets to the inevitable problem of trying to deal yet again with the governance problems that they create. Next week, we'll be looking at the way in which both the United States and Europe has struggled to try to deal with some of these issues in the book by Cass. And so we'll explore some of those issues as we try to poke around on them next week. The basic puzzle that seems inescapable is how, no matter what road we come down, we get back to the fundamental problem of scale. How we try to deal with global, worldwide climate change issues within governance systems where the scale of the governance system doesn't match the scale of the problem that we're trying to deal with. That we'll come back and talk about in much more detail next week.